Good morning. Further action against Russia, more diplomacy between nations, but the conflict on the ground in Ukraine intensifies. President Joe Biden has reassured Ukraine of his support and promised more funding. And in an address to the nation, President Zielenski has urged Ukrainians not to retreat. These are the latest developments. Visa and Mastercard have suspended operations in Russia. Credit and debit cards issued by Russian banks will no longer work outside the country. Meanwhile, in a 30-minute phone call with President Zielenski last night, Joe Biden reiterated his commitment to provide security, humanitarian and economic assistance to Ukraine. While here in the UK, Boris Johnson has unveiled a 6-point plan that he hopes world leaders will follow to ensure Russia fails in its invasion of Ukraine, including mobilizing an international humanitarian coalition. And all the while, the humanitarian crisis grows. Aid agencies estimate that the number of Ukrainian refugees could reach 1.5 million this weekend, as Ukrainian cities face a continued Russian siege. Sally Lockwood has the latest on the crisis.
The world has clamoured to show its support for Ukraine. But on the ground, the fight is theirs and theirs alone. Russian forces are now said to be in control of this military base in the southern city of Kherson. President Zielenski seeking to buoy a beleaguered nation as Russian forces advance towards a third nuclear power plant.
Ukraine, which we know, love, protect, and will not give up to any enemy. It is a special heroism to protest when your city is occupied, even temporarily, when you don't have a weapon and in response you receive gunshots, and you don't run.
The battle overhead remains the most contentious issue. Ukraine claims this video shows a Russian helicopter being shot down. President Zielenski has repeatedly appealed to the US and NATO to establish a no-fly zone. But Putin's latest threat, that this would be viewed as participation in the conflict, has done little to change Western leaders' minds. In a meeting at a Polish border crossing with the US Secretary of State, Ukraine's foreign minister vowed to win this war.
If we lose the skies, there will be much more blood on the ground, and that will be the blood of civilians. And I don't want anyone to share responsibility for their blood.
Ultimately, their strength, their resolve, their determination, backed by the United States and backed by the world, is going to prevail.
A new economic blow to Russia, this time from Visa and Mastercard, suspending their operations in Russia. And a fresh diplomatic attempt from Israel's Prime Minister. In a backdrop of anti-war protests at home, Naftali Bennett flew secretly to Moscow on Saturday for a 3-hour meeting with Vladimir Putin, then on to Berlin for talks with the German Chancellor. For people here in the southern region of Mariupol, escape isn't even an option. Plans for a humanitarian corridor still on hold after Russia violated an agreed ceasefire. But Israel, a country with good relations on both sides, could now prove vital in finding a desperately needed breakthrough. Sally Lockwood, Sky News.
Well, British military intelligence says that Russian forces were targeting populated areas in Ukraine, but that the strength of resistance is slowing the Russian advance. Within the last hour, the Ministry of Defense has tweeted this update. The scale and strength of Ukrainian resistance continues to surprise Russia. It has responded by targeting populated areas in multiple locations, including Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Mariupol. This is likely to represent an effort to break Ukrainian morale. Russia has previously used similar tactics in Chechnya in 1999 and Syria in 2016, employing both air and ground-based munitions. Russian supply lines reportedly continue to be targeted, slowing the rate of advance of their ground forces. There is a realistic possibility that Russia is now attempting to conceal fuel trucks as regular support trucks to minimize losses. Well, about 1.5 million people are expected to have fled Ukraine by the end of today, with Poland taking in more than 780,000 refugees so far, and that number continues to grow. A little earlier, I spoke to Chris Meltzer from the UN Refugee Agency, who said this is an international situation and countries need to continue showing solidarity.
This might go on for many weeks, and that's why we're asking for the solidarity. The people in Poland, but also in Romania and Hungary and Slovakia, even in little Moldova that accepted much more than 100,000 refugees. These countries are showing a lot of solidarity, but we must see this. This is not a Ukrainian Poland and not Ukrainian Romanian crisis. This is at least a European crisis, actually an international crisis. And that's why these countries need help and solidarity, like the people need help and solidarity.
Let's bring in Adam Parsons, who's in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And Adam, it was so interesting talking to Chris there. He's a representative from the UNHCR who said that they've never experienced numbers like this in such a small time frame, even comparing it to the Rohingya and saying that it was nothing, that was nothing compared to what they're seeing now.
Yeah, the numbers flooding out of Ukraine are absolutely extraordinary. I think we will hit that 1.5 million figure today. We're looking at about a couple of 100,000 people a day going out of this country. I think you have to put this into some kind of context. You're talking about 3.5% of the population leaving their own country over the course of just over a week. It's an extraordinary movement of people. And also that figure doesn't tell the whole story, because that is about refugees. That's people leaving Ukraine to seek refuge in another country. There are probably as many people, again, who are simply displaced within Ukraine, who have left Kharkiv or Kyiv or Mariupol or wherever it might be, in order to seek sanctuary and potentially here in Western Ukraine, where you are much further from the fighting. So the disruption to this country is absolutely colossal. And I think interesting hearing that military intelligence assessment. I think we are seeing something play out here, which is that bluntly, Ukraine's armed resistance has been much, much stronger and more resolute than the world perhaps predicted. And at the same time, Russia's ability as a super military power on the ground has been worse than we predicted. Why might that be? Well, I think for one thing, Ukraine has an enormous army with a lot of reservists and an incredible amount of spirit. We were filming over the past day or so outside a recruitment station, the queues going on, hundreds of people outside one station replicated across this nation. People are queuing up to join, to fight and to defend their country. At the same time, you have Russian forces who are using a lot of equipment that is obsolete. I think there is a question about morale. There's plenty of young soldiers who didn't realize they were coming into a war zone, don't particularly want to be here. And evidently, Russia's battle plans are nowhere near as advanced as we expected. Now, let's not be naive. Russia has some enormous weaponry. It is continuing to attack strategically important places. It's going to advancing on another nuclear power station, on hydro facilities, and President Zielenski, in his address last night, was emphatic, telling his people to fight back. At the same time, he wants diplomatic efforts, whether that is from Israel, from the United States, from Germany, from the UK. What he really wants is a no-fly zone from NATO. At the moment, he's not getting it, and he says that is crucial to saving his country.
Adam, thank you so much. Well, the West has refused to impose that no-fly zone above Ukraine, despite repeated calls from President Zielenski. Sky's Trevor Phillips has been speaking to Kurt Volker, who's a former US ambassador to NATO and was the special representative for Ukraine during Donald Trump's administration.
First off, we've done this in the past. We've executed no-fly zones. We've done it over the Kurdish areas in Iraq, for example, when Saddam Hussein was attacking them. So we know how to do this. There is a protocol for this. Secondly, we make very clear this is for humanitarian purposes only. We are there to prevent attacks on the civilian population from the air. And we do this over Kyiv and Western Ukraine, so it's limited geographically. We are not coming close to Russian borders. And we make very clear the rules of engagement. We will not be striking any ground targets, any Russian forces, unless fired upon. And we will not be striking any Russian aircraft or helicopters, provided they remain outside the zone. And if they enter the zone, then there's a protocol of escalating tactics to escort them out. But if they refuse, then there would be the prospect of firing on them. But many ways to avoid that. And I think the Russians will understand this as well. They might test us, but then I think they don't want to draw us into a larger conflict either.
Well, let me push back a little bit on that. Do you really think that Mr. Putin is going to play by rules that NATO has set out? He hasn't been interested in NATO, what NATO's had to say about anything thus far.
Yeah, I think it's force that he respects. It's force that he listens to, not the rules that are stated. So if he sees that we are doing it and we are prepared to follow through, I think he will adjust.
Well, let's talk about no-fly zones, and we're joined now by former senior Royal Air Force officer, Air Marshal Ed Stringer. Ed, good morning to you. Thank you so much for talking to us. You've been involved in no-fly zones extensively. Let's just talk, basics here. What is a no-fly zone?
A no-fly zone is where you delineate an area of airspace and you essentially say that cannot be used for military purposes. And what that tends to mean is it can't be used for any purposes at all. But what I would say, in listening to that clip, I think needs clarifying, is this is not some form of benign air policing. What you have to do is sanitize that, anything that can control in that airspace. That will be surface-to-air missiles, et cetera, radars. And so all the no-fly zones I've been involved in have been an extensive operation to suppress an opposition's ability to control airspace. So I think, listening to that, it will be quite difficult to set these discrete boundaries and say you can do this, but you can't do that.
So it's quite an aggressive action that would be needed to delineate that NFZ and keep it clear.
Yes, it's an aggressive action, and it is a proper military operation. It just happens to be run by people who tend to wear blue uniforms, not khaki ones. But it involves a lot of activity air to ground. As I say, it is not just some form of benign air policing and escorting bad aircraft out of the area and telling them not to do it again. So essentially, what you're doing here is an act of war and has to be considered that way. So
if we were to set up a no-fly zone, would that be seen as an escalation? Because Putin has said exactly that yesterday.
Well, I think it will be seen as an escalation in this context. And I was involved in the no-fly zone that was just mentioned, the humanitarian one in northern Iraq, which could absolutely be described as a humanitarian operation against, if you like, an enemy Saddam Hussein that we had just vanquished in Kuwait. I think this is a very different geopolitical situation.
It would also be a very different no-fly zone, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, exactly. And we're up against a great military power that would be Russia. So this idea that somehow we could carve out areas and call this just humanitarian, it would be seen by Russia, as Putin has said, as an act by NATO to fundamentally limit its military operations.
And every time that this has been mentioned, not every time, but frequently, the argument is we can't do that because that would result in us shooting down Russian planes. Would that be the end game of a no-fly zone?
Yeah, that ultimately is what you set up a no-fly zone to be able to do. And with rules of engagement, with the congested airspace that there would be, with the scale and the range, the quality of equipment that both sides would put forward, you could see this escalating very rapidly into some form of great air conflict over Ukraine. And as I say, it would drag in all the ground elements as well.
Did you have to shoot many planes down in the no-fly zones over Iraq?
Well, Saddam Hussein didn't have much of an air force. A lot of it had been removed during the Gulf War. But what he tried to do was use ground-based systems and did end up firing at the coalition aircraft quite extensively, which resulted in quite a serious campaign to suppress his enemy air defences, which is a technical phrase for bombing his stuff on the ground.
What about ground-based artillery? If you're policing the airspace, you're not going to stop those, are you?
No, that's the point. So you could actually say here, you could easily postulate a case where even if your no-fly zone was successful, you could be flying top cover and watching the sort of horrendous scenes on the ground that we're seeing at the moment, while actually stopping the Ukrainians flying their effective drones, because a no-fly zone is a no-fly zone.
So would it be more effective than sending in weapons, which is what we're doing now?
Effective in what sense? And I can absolutely see, and I do sympathise with why Zielenski is asking for a no-fly zone, because he knows that is NATO getting involved in this conflict. If you want to talk about effectiveness in stopping Russian ground operations, then supplying the sort of drones and light anti-tank weaponry and similar systems on which we've been training the Ukrainians now for well over 5 to 10 years, I think would help them conduct the ground operation best.
So given your experience, if we were to implement a no-fly zone, as Zielinski keeps asking us to do, that would be an escalation, and do you think that would lead to an all-out World War III?
It would be an escalation. I suspect it would give Putin the out he craves, and that he could now craft the narrative that this is now NATO revealing its true colours and trying to attack Russia and take Ukraine. And he would hope that that would galvanise the Russian population. At the moment, must be questioning why it has got involved in this operation. But of course, I could see why the Ukrainians would want it, and I could see, I can see a humanitarian case, and I can see how that will become compelling. So you could see that there will be a force of public opinion in the West that would demand that something will be done. But yes, it will be an escalation. And if Putin escalates, and given his track record at the moment, then it is quite easy to sketch a path to a full-on conflict between NATO and Russia.
OK. Marshal Ed Stringer, thank you so much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk about what's happening on the ground, because intense fighting continues between those Ukrainian and Russian forces. Russia was accused of breaking a temporary ceasefire in the encircled cities of Mariupol and Volnovakha after evacuation routes were set up to allow civilians to escape the fighting. In the southwest of the country, Russian forces continue to advance on the city of Mykolaiv, close to the crucial economic hub of Odessa. Around the capital, the governor of the Kyiv region says Russian forces have taken a psychiatric hospital in Borodyanka with more than 600 patients inside. While north of Kyiv, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense claims it shot down a Russian helicopter near Kozarovichi. From Kyiv, our special correspondent Alex Crawford reports on the fight for the capital.
The Russian troops are getting closer and closer to the capital. They're now only 8 kilometers away, with the Ukrainian military desperately trying to stop Russian soldiers who are pressing into the center of Irpin. The sounds of street-by-street fighting and thud of war is a constant inside the town. And in the middle of this all, there are terrified civilians, hundreds gingerly making their way across a bombed bridge, hastily patched together with a makeshift walkway. Most are women and children, gripping each other's hands, holding their pets close. Among them, too, many elderly, clasping the only possessions they've managed to grab. It's all they have left in the world now. There are Ukrainian soldiers trying to guide them across. They know they're just ahead of the advancing Russian troops, and the window to get them to safety is narrowing.
You see that Putin attacking children, Putin attacking elderly people, Putin attacking women, and this is no any rules of law. He is a military crime.
There's no humanitarian corridor here, and no real safe place. This is only the next staging post. And the sounds of war aren't lessening. Instead, they're getting louder and following them. They're exhausted and spent, and often weeping with relief, or just glad to be alive.
They're very stressed. Tell me quickly, are you all right?
I'm all right. I was in a car, and we saw this Russian better. He strike on us, and we...
God save us.
God save us, yes.
The Russian army is leaving a trail of despair and destruction as it cuts its way through to the capital. Aerial footage of Bucha, another town on the outskirts of Kyiv, showed burning vehicles and abandoned Russian hardware. A stream of Ukrainian soldiers emerged from Irpin, looking drained of all energy and defeated. It looked like it had been a tough battle. Those picking up the fight know it will not be easy, and some who escaped had hair-raising tales. Did you see the Russian soldiers?
Yeah,
are they close enough? You saw them. How many were there? What were they doing?
I saw just like maybe 2 or 3 people, and they were shooting, so I just like ran from there. I didn't want to watch it.
Can you work out what they're trying to attack? Are they attacking everything?
They're attacking everything. They didn't shoot just something special. I guess they're shooting everything they see. So
yeah. What have they tied you up with? Oh my gosh! Did they think you were Russian?
Probably yes, but we have all documents. We can prove that we are not Russians. We are Ukrainians.
A Ukrainian soldier investigates and questions them, and they produce their passports. Any young man not fighting is viewed with great suspicion. But he's satisfied they are Ukrainians and cuts him free. Those who fled are now desperately hoping they can reach sanctuary. But it seems the Russian military is moving relentlessly forward, and they're being transported into the capital a few kilometers away, where they fear they'll be next. Inside Kyiv, there's non-stop work to try to shore up defences and protect themselves amidst increasingly strident demands for international help.
We are on our own land, in our own country, and we will fight for this country. In every town, in every city, on each street, from each building, we are ready and we will fight because we are the truth on our side and the God on our side. So we will win.
They're calling for a no-fly zone, but with the world looking on, now all they can do is wait for an army they fear will inevitably arrive. Alex Crawford, Sky News, Kyiv.
Well, Visa and Mastercard are suspending operations in Russia, meaning credit and debit cards issued by Russian banks will no longer work outside the country. Let's bring in our Milena Veselinovic, who's in the newsroom for us this morning. Morning, Milena. So this news breaking overnight.
Morning, Kimberly. Yes, it's just the latest in the raft of economic sanctions levelled against Russia. Mastercard said that their cards issued in Russia will no longer work in their system. Equally, cards issued abroad will no longer be accepted by Russian ATMs and in Russian shops. And the company did say they didn't take this decision lightly, considering they've been operating in Russia for more than 25 years. Similarly, Visa said that they were in talks to suspend all transactions in the country in the coming days, and their CEO said this was due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, considering that those two companies handle more than 90% of all debit and credit card transactions outside of China, this is going to be very significant. And earlier on Saturday, we've also heard that PayPal also has shut down their operations in the country, and it comes after SWIFT, that interbanking global messaging system, has cut out a number of Russian financial institutions from their operations, and that will make it incredibly hard to make international payments out of Russia or to Russia. And this is all having a really detrimental effect on the Russian economy. The national currency ruble has tumbled down by more than a third to a record low. And the people who are really feeling this are the ordinary Russian citizens. They're experiencing high levels of inflation, long queues in front of ATMs. So they are really feeling this economic pain. Now, the thinking behind these Western sanctions is that will compel Russian President Putin to get to the negotiating table, perhaps some sort of a compromise over Ukraine. But really, so far, there doesn't seem to be any sign of that happening at all.
Milena, thank you. Well, Boris Johnson has claimed Vladimir Putin is trying to rewrite the rules of the international order by military force. Mr. Johnson has launched a 6-point plan of how the international community should resolve the crisis, including sanctions and an attempt to find a diplomatic solution. He will hold talks with leaders from Canada, the Netherlands and Central European countries in London next week. Our political correspondent Joe Pike has more.
The language, the rhetoric from Boris Johnson here is typically tough, aimed at Vladimir Putin and mirroring what we've heard from the Prime Minister in the last couple of weeks. The difference here is where he is saying it, in the New York Times, and it follows those 3 interviews Boris Johnson gave to 3 different European newspapers yesterday in Germany, Italy and in Spain. Papers of record read by opinion formers. I think one, of course, he wants to try and get a broad coalition of support behind his response to Ukraine, his idea of how to respond. But also, I think in the back of his mind, perhaps he wants to change perceptions and improve his reputation. He is, of course, a controversial figure amongst some on the European continent because of his role in Brexit. And in the US, particularly on the Democratic side of politics, some view him with a little suspicion, perhaps because of his relationship with President Trump, but also comments he's made in the past about Barack Obama and his attitude towards Northern Ireland. All of this is a prelude, though. These media interventions are a prelude to a week of Downing Street diplomacy starting tomorrow, when Justin Trudeau of Canada and Mark Rutte of the Netherlands arrive at number 10 for talks. Then on Tuesday, leaders of the V4, 4 Central European nations will be in London. Those are the leaders of the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary and Slovakia. No doubt Boris Johnson does really believe in the role that the UK can play in this crisis and the response to what Vladimir Putin has done. But also, perhaps, he sees an opportunity to improve his slightly battered reputation home and abroad.
Well, the Premier League has continued to show solidarity with Ukraine following Russia's invasion. Jackie's here with me now, and Jackie, football, again, standing with Ukraine.
Yeah, football stands together, you know, is the motto, and there were plenty of flags yesterday. There were lots of screens with the split Ukrainian flag, yellow and blue, as you can see there on the picture around the grounds. And this happened before every single Premier League match. And it was all fine. Everybody was observing it. It was all going very well, except in the Chelsea match against Burnley, when the fans there decided that during the minute's applause, they would chant Roman Abramovich's name. Let's have a listen. As you can hear, they were booed by the Burnley fans, and Thomas Tuchel spoke afterwards. He was not pleased. He said, this was not a moment for other messages. We do it for Ukraine. There is not a second opinion in this situation. We should stand together. And I just think he was pretty furious, actually, that the fans had chosen that moment to do that. There was lots of tributes as well in Australia as they woke up to the news, the very sad news that Shane Warne had passed away. And there were people dropping off flowers and beer cans at his statue at the MCG. People are still in shock there in Australia. There's been some breaking news in the last hour that the Premier of Victoria, Dan Andrews, who offered a state funeral to the family. The family have accepted the state funeral offer. There'll be more details in the final in the next few days, but he will have a state funeral, and they will name a stand after him at the MCG. His manager, James Erskine, has been speaking out about the shock they are all still feeling.
The three children are in complete shock. I think they, you know, I spoke to them yesterday and again, and I think they, you know, Jackson just said, we just expect him to walk in the door. This is like a bad dream. And spoke to Simone, who was really upset. And obviously Keith, Shane's father, is, you know, a pretty strong individual, but, you know, like everybody, he's just shattered. They can't believe what's happened.
It is unbelievable, isn't it? 52.
I should imagine they're all absolutely broken. It was very interesting to see Liz Hurley's messages on Instagram yesterday, you know, absolutely heartbroken. And I did a piece on Shane Warne's book, and, you know, he dedicates a whole chapter to his relationship with Elizabeth Hurley. And, you know, she was one of the loves of his life, and, you know, she's absolutely devastated as well. It's just it is all very bleak and horrible news.
Hello again. We've got a few updates on the Russian invasion of Ukraine this morning. Dr. Tedros, he's the head of the World Health Organization. He has just tweeted and retweeted a WHO tweet saying that WHO has confirmed several attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, causing multiple deaths and injuries. Additional reports are being investigated. Attacks on healthcare facilities or workers breach medical neutrality and are violations of international humanitarian law. And then below the tweet, you can see there he's tweeted a WHO tweet, retweeted it, saying that WHO has published 6 verified reports of attacks on healthcare in Ukraine. So that is Dr. Tedros saying that there are serious violations of international humanitarian law taking place. Also, the Ukrainian Armed Forces General Staff this morning have said that more than 11,000 Russian troops have been killed since Moscow launched an invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. So that is Reuters. They are quoting the Ukrainian Armed Forces General Staff. Obviously, that comes from the Ukrainians, and it is unverified. A day earlier, it put the Russian casualties at over 10,000. So there's a couple of updates for you. On the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's day 11 now. Now, hundreds of people gathered in London's Trafalgar Square, which was one of 2 protests planned this weekend in London, with more scheduled around the country today. Some of those present at the protest described the support needed for their families and relatives in Ukraine who have stayed to fight. Let's speak now to Valeria. She's a Ukrainian national who lives in London, and his family is joining the fight against the Russian invasion. Valeria, thank you so much for talking to us this morning. How are you and how is your family?
Hi. These past days, I don't answer that question anymore because I don't know what to say. And I don't ask these questions from the people who are in Ukraine at the moment, because most of my family is in Ukraine. Most of my friends are in Ukraine. And there is just no answer.
Do you speak to them?
Yes,
Do you speak to them often?
I speak to them. Well, I speak to some. I don't speak to others because many of them are in the army or in the territorial defense units, so they really don't have a lot of time to talk. Many of my friends are volunteering to deliver food to the areas that are now starving because of the Russian invasion.
What areas are those, Valeria?
Near Kyiv, like Bucha and Irpin. These are the suburbs of Kyiv, where the situation is really, really difficult. It's back and forth between the Russian control. So the Russian army controls it, or not army, I don't know who is there exactly, but the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces, and then it's kind of goes back and forth, and there is no humanitarian corridor. So that the Russians agreed to have a humanitarian corridor, then they shelled the humanitarian corridors when people were about to leave the areas. So they were not able to evacuate people or deliver anything, and so the Red Cross isn't working because the Red Cross only works when there are humanitarian corridors. But Russians obviously are using barbarian attacks on civilians, and they're also not allowing people to evacuate or deliver medicine, goods. And I've been spending my time between helping my friends evacuate newborns from Kyiv in Irpin and Bucha, which is the suburbs of Kyiv, where they have no nappies, they have no food, mothers have no milk. So it's just devastating. And
that bombing of the humanitarian corridors, that was in Mariupol yesterday. They agreed, and then they went ahead and bombed it. So let's just talk about...
It was not only in Mariupol, it was in Irpin as well. They agreed to evacuate people near Kyiv, but then they started shooting them.
Mm-hmm. That was a picture of the collapsed bridge, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it?
Yeah, one of them, yes.
So let's talk about the practicalities of what you're doing. I mean, you said you're helping people evacuate newborns from Kyiv. How do you go about doing that? You're here in London, so how do you go about doing that? What else are you doing?
We have a lot of networks of different people. So I have different contacts of people doing different things in Kyiv, either delivering food or delivering medicines to older people, or delivering. So I have a network of young mothers who are helping pregnant women or women just after birth. They're helping them, trying to deliver nappies and other things that they may need in the first days. So
how do you get them to them, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, sometimes we get them to them, sometimes we don't, depending on what is happening on the ground. So people there in Kyiv, they now have a lot of different cars that people have donated to them for volunteering purposes, for humanitarian aid, or needs of delivery food to our forces even. And I am coordinating a lot of it because I receive a lot of requests from different people around Kyiv, or even around the country, to be honest. Like I get requests from Mariupol or from Poltava, from near Sumy, because Sumy is also a hot spot. And then I know a lot of people in different areas as well who are working on those. So I kind of transfer that information, and then I help with donations and coordinating with donors, and coordinating with different expatriate communities in London, but also in other countries like Netherlands, Germany. People are helping from everywhere, and I'm just... There's a lot of work to be done on coordinating of all of these efforts to make sure that the efforts are helpful.
It's extraordinary that in such a short time, this network, what sounds like is a network, has sprung up. I want to ask you, because we are running out of time here, but how do people get involved in this effort? Because a lot of people will want to do something. They'll be seeing what's going on. They'll be seeing all those people fleeing, and they'll want to do something. So how do they, yes, they can go to the protests, but how do they actually provide you with support?
Exactly. A very good question. So there is a website which is called defendukraine.org, where you can go and find information on various directions of work, including donations, humanitarian support, boycotting Russia, what you can do to help kind of cut ties with Russia and destroy their economy, so that they finally realize what they're doing is unacceptable. And you can also go to, for example, in London, there is a Ukrainian club, and there is also a Ukrainian embassy in London, who both are helping people direct their efforts into the right direction, so that the donations are helpful, so that the clothes that they're bringing is actually something that people need there. And they have all the other different work streams where they can advise on what's the best.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there. But Valeria, thank you so much. Thanks a lot for talking to us.
Thank you.
Now, President Zielenski says that Ukraine will receive more Starlink internet terminals next week, following a conversation with Elon Musk. Mr. Zielenski said in a tweet that he's grateful to the SpaceX chief for supporting Ukraine with words and deeds. Last week, Mr. Musk warned that Starlink could be targeted as internet is disrupted in Ukraine. It's the only active non-Russian communications system. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has told the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken that China opposes any moves that add fuel to the flames in Ukraine. China has broken ranks with Europe and the US on imposing sanctions against Russia and called for negotiation to resolve the crisis. Meanwhile, US officials have traveled to Venezuela for talks with the country's government to determine whether or not they're prepared to drop their close ties with Russia. The trip is the highest-level US visit to Venezuela since the two countries broke diplomatic relations amid a campaign of US sanctions. Coming up on Sky News Breakfast, we'll take another look at this morning's papers with the entrepreneur Kate Hardcastle and the presenter and writer Matthew Stadlen. The entrepreneur Kate Hardcastle and the presenter and writer Matt Stadlen. Good morning to you both. Thanks a lot for joining us. Kate, do you want to kick us off? £7 a gallon for oil. What is
I
it?
think
The
many
Mail.
of us didn't think we would
Page
see
4.
the day when. Many of us didn't see the day when we would see that price at the pumps, and obviously fuel and the impact of that cost and that open market and that push for demand that was already happening because of the demand post-lockdown has now exacerbated as the world market is certainly challenged with what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine. And whilst this article very much focuses on a call from RAC and other bodies to try and do something with the VAT rate, I think we have to remember, obviously, the impact of fuel goes so much further. It's a key ingredient to most of the things we buy, the food that we buy, the haulage of the food we buy and the goods that we buy. So huge impact for businesses and manufactured goods too. Absolutely, whilst we turn our attention to things like this fuel, the cost of living crisis in the UK, there's absolutely no lack of understanding from me of the real civilian crisis that's going on elsewhere. But this is a real challenging time for so many families. We had those headlines just a month ago, people having to make the choice between heating and eating. This is going to carry on in terms of a cost of living crisis right through. And I fear for autumn where I think the impact will be most felt.
It's so interesting when we were talking about the cost of living crisis. This is really just not something that we would have anticipated. Matt, it's really going to get hard for a lot of people, isn't it?
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that the crisis in Ukraine is piling on the misery for people up and down the country. As Kate was saying, we've already got a cost of living crisis, people choosing between heating and eating. We've got that huge energy hike. I just got my email through this week from my supplier saying my prices are going to go up. We've got that round the corner, and huge inflation. And now because of what's going on in Ukraine, because of Putin's monstrosity, it's going to hurt even more. But I think we have to accept that when we're watching children being murdered by the Russian dictator, we have to take our own share of the pain on this. And while we have imposed sanctions, it is true to say that Europe is still addicted to Russian gas and oil. And in other words, we are pumping billions of pounds a week into Putin's war effort because we have not cut off his gas supply. So to that extent, we continue to be complicit.
Kate, what do you think? Is this something that we're going to have to act on sooner rather than later?
The UK isn't as reliant on that, but we buy from a world market, and that's where the price is born out of. And I think we are taking actions. You asked me earlier, and we were cut short in terms of, are we doing enough? No one's ever going to feel, I don't think, that we're doing enough when that bloodshed, that everyday terror is piling out. All of us are watching on in absolute horror, wanting to do everything we can and feeling pretty helpless. I think we've got to make sure that the intensity increases day by day. And I think what I am pleased to have seen is the stepping up of organisations, charities, and just people like you and I out there trying to do everything that we can do to support this. Is never going to feel enough.
Matt, let's have a look at the front page of the Sunday Mirror, a striking picture, just one of so many that are coming out of this crisis.
Yeah, we've seen all week, haven't we, the quite breathtaking bravery of people in Ukraine. And that's why I say we have to be prepared to accept pain ourselves. And this picture is in the southeastern city, I think, of Mariupol, and it went viral yesterday. These are unarmed Ukrainian civilians facing down Russian invading soldiers who are firing into the air and forcing them to retreat. And one of the big stories of this war is that Russian soldiers, I think many of them didn't realize that they were going to war, and those that did thought they'd be welcomed with open arms by their fellow Slavs. And of course, that has been very, very far from the reality. We also know in Kherson, which is in the south of Ukraine as well, it's the only major Ukrainian city to have been captured by the Russians. There's also been incredible defiance, 2,000 people, I think, yesterday out on the streets. And that extraordinary image of a Ukrainian protester putting a Ukrainian flag on a Russian tank. And as I was saying in the last hour, we've also seen Ukrainian farmers literally towing away Russian heavy armoured vehicles. So the bravery of the Ukrainian people, which has followed the bravery of their extraordinary president, Zielenski, I think this should inspire all of us to do our bit.
A lot of people have come out, haven't they, and joined these protests. Guardian Online, they say tens of thousands joined rallies really around the world.
That's right, yes. And there has been the public outcry, the cities like New York and Paris full of tens of thousands of protesters, many of them raising the sunflower, the national flower of the Ukraine, placards reading "Peace is wanted." There is certainly many people wanting to have their voice heard, wanting to come together, wanting to stop the bloodshed and the terror. And I think that it is for many people not anywhere near the feeling that they can do enough. Many people rallying to get donations to organisations that are going to try get those items that we've just heard in your last feature, the nappies that need to get there, the sanitary products that need to get there. This is about people trying to do the right thing when I feel they feel incredibly limited in what they can do. It's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. It's heartbreaking all round, isn't it? Matt and Kate, thank you so much for talking to us and being with us this morning. Hopefully next time we'll have a bit more, I don't know, happier news to talk about. But thank you so much. Enjoy your Sunday both.
Thank you.
Well, coming up in the next hour on Sky News Breakfast, the WHO confirms several attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, causing multiple deaths and injuries as Russia's assaults continues.